This podcast reflects the personal opinions of the participants and should not be taken as medical advice. The available information on the COVID-19 pandemic is constantly evolving, and some of the data, statistics, and opinions on this podcast may be obsolete by the time this is available for listening. Please visit the CDC or WHO websites or contact your local health department for up-to-date information and recommendations. Thank you for listening.
We're moving into uncharted territory.
Millions of students will now have to stay home.
The financial markets in free fall.
A nation on edge as efforts to contain a global pandemic grind public life to a halt.
All right, my friends, welcome back. This is the Corona Pandemic Podcast. Yes, we are back from a little break. Dr. Ryan Hata is with us. As always, Dr. Ryan, welcome back, my friend.
Hi, Chris, and thank you so much for having me. I hope everyone is doing well.
Well, I'm okay. Thanks. But it seems like this pandemic is not going away anytime soon, and in fact, it seems to be on the upswing. So, first of all, let's get right to it. There's been obviously breakthroughs with vaccines, plural, since the last time we spoke. At great success rates, apparently, right? Everyone's excited about it and roll them out and let's do this thing. And that's a whole nother issue, like how the rollout is going, especially in the United States. But let's explain to me and to a layman that there is more than one vaccine. What's the difference? Should we take one and not the other, or what is the deal?
Yes, well, that's a great question, and that's a really important topic, and it's a topic that's dominating everybody's conversation, certainly within the healthcare world and also on the media and just in general. People are very concerned about it. They have a lot of questions, but they're also very excited. And I first want to just talk a little bit about vaccines in general and talk a little bit about how these vaccines, some of the vaccines that are coming down the pipe, are actually different. They're unique, and they're in some ways it's very exciting what's happening. But in other ways, it's given us a lot of there's been a lot of misconception about it, and there is a lot of misgiving, a lot of heightened anxiety. And so I want to talk a little bit about those. And first of all, I guess I'll just discuss a little bit about vaccines. And most people know what vaccines are. They're pretty straightforward. They're a way for your body to develop an immune response to a pathogen, generally a virus of some sort, or a bacteria, without actually being exposed to that pathogen and having to go through the infection process. In other words, you don't get infected by it. There have been traditionally many different types of vaccines. The more common ones are what are called dead virus vaccines or live attenuated, which is where they inject viral particles or a dead virus or an attenuated live virus. So it's a virus that doesn't have the capacity to replicate within you, but it still is sort of technically a virus that's overall pretty whole. And what that does is it allows your body's immune response to be exposed to it in a limited capacity, and then it develops an immune response that your body's amazing. I mean, God did an incredible thing in developing and designing the human body. But what it does is it allows your body to not only recognize, but also remember that particular pathogen so that when you're exposed to it again in the future, your body mounts an immune response that nips the infection in the bud before it ever becomes a true infection. And people want to think that vaccines are often 100% effective, but that's not really the case. Vaccines are designed in many cases to be a certain percentage effective, which basically means you will either get a minimally symptomatic disease or a certain percent of the population, even though they're vaccinated, will still get clinical disease, but it tends to be of a lesser severity. So that's sort of the general idea. And most people understand that. We won't belabor the point because most people really do understand that pretty well. But what we're seeing with this is a pretty unprecedented, and that word's been used a lot. And it's true though. This is an unprecedented effort to roll out a vaccine, to develop vaccines, again, plural vaccines, against a pathogen that is really entirely new, something that we have never seen. And so to go back to kind of what we had talked about maybe a few months ago was, the SARS-CoV-2 or the COVID-19 coronavirus it's a novel virus. So when we say it's a novel virus, when you hear that term, what it means is no human had been exposed to it. Therefore, there was no innate immunity in any human being to this virus before it came. That's very, very different from almost every other virus out there where we've been exposed to many, many, many different viruses. And so the human population as a whole tends to have some element of immunity already built up. With this, it was a totally new thing. And so every single person that was exposed to this was susceptible to some degree or another. And what has happened over the past 9 months or so with the development of these vaccines is they have taken a novel virus and they've developed novel vaccines, which are, again, some of these vaccines are novel. They're brand new. They've never been done before. And that's given rise to a lot of anxiety again and misconceptions and whatnot, specifically with some of the more high-tech vaccines like the mRNA vaccines. So that kind of gives you maybe a 30,000-foot overview of the vaccines. And then we can talk a little bit more about some of the specific vaccines in a bit. But does that sort of help
yeah. When you say mRNA, that gives some folks maybe anxiety itself. It's like, wait a minute, are you changing my cellular makeup? Like, is this one of these things that we're worried about? You're changing my DNA? I've heard that a lot. What exactly does that mean?
Yes, and that's one of the big misconceptions and one of the anxieties that's out there. And we'll talk a little bit about, later in the podcast, we'll talk a little bit about sort of truth and mistruth and these kind of things that are, these pieces of misinformation that are going into a lot of the misconceptions. But first off, we'll just talk in a gross fashion just about sort of DNA, RNA, and that kind of stuff. So, DNA is the basic. It's the way that it has the codes for every protein in your body. Every basically piece of your body is encoded in these DNA strands. And we won't get into it because it's way too much of a topic. But if you haven't taken a cellular biology or molecular genetics course in college, I would, you can get these things free now online. And you want to go to obviously a reputable source. But if you have a basic understanding of biology, it's probably worth going through this just to understand it if you're interested. And I'm, kind of a nerd, so I like this kind of stuff. But, it's probably worth going through because it really gives you an appreciation for how complex the body really is and how complex human development really is, and how the information that makes up our entire being, at least our physical being, is encoded in this DNA process. Well, DNA codes for virtually every piece of the human body on a microscopic level. And it doesn't just go straight from DNA to whatever, the protein or however. What happens is your body takes DNA and through a series of enzymes and chemical reactions that are, pretty complex, it gets transformed into what's called mRNA, which is messenger RNA. And that is then exported out of the nucleus of the cell, and it encounters within the general body of the cell, called the cytoplasm, these other proteins that then use that messenger RNA, which is, again, coded from the DNA. It uses it to then create a protein. And again, the process is pretty complicated, but just suffice it to say, it uses that mRNA to create a protein. And then those proteins are expressed or sent out of the cell or within the cell to do certain things, whatever that certain thing is, and to help you in digestion or in, neurotransmitters or whatever type of particular thing that cell is designed to do. The DNA is basically transcribed into an mRNA and then, transcribed into an mRNA, and then that is used to create proteins. And what these vaccines do is it introduces a foreign piece of mRNA, messenger mRNA. And this messenger mRNA is a piece of mRNA from the virus itself. This is from the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And this particular piece codes for what is called the spike protein, which a lot of people have heard about. It codes for the spike protein, but it doesn't code for the rest of the virus.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. The spike protein, meaning those little bumpy things you see on the picture of when you get really close on it, those spikes on the outside.
Exactly. Those are the little spikes that are on the outside of the virus. And what those spikes do is they are designed to bind to the cell, okay, to your human cells, and they bind with a certain other protein that is on the cell. So all of your cells have all these proteins all over them, and they're in many ways receptors, kind of like, like your mailbox is a receptacle for your mail. Well, these types of proteins are sort of receptors for things to go in and out of the cell. So, or to do certain chemical reactions around or within the cell. Well, this virus has a spike protein on its surface that binds to a certain receptor on the surface of your human cells, and then it tricks the cell into importing the virus into the cell itself, and then the virus has a whole set of, again, RNA, which is sort of that coded material that's used to make protein. And that RNA is used by your own cellular machinery to then produce proteins for the virus, which makes another virus. And it makes more RNA. And so it basically uses your own cellular machinery to create more viruses. And then this process just keeps going on and on and on. And there's a lot more that goes into it with your immune response as it recognizes some of the foreign particles of the virus and so on and so forth. That creates a very hefty immune response, which, if it gets out of control, can be extremely dangerous as well. But to kind of go back to the mRNA vaccines, these mRNA vaccines use just a small piece of the viral mRNA without introducing the virus itself, and it introduces that mRNA into your cell, and then your cell uses its own cellular machinery to produce a small little spike protein, a part of the spike protein that your body can then recognize as a foreign object. And people get very concerned, as you said. They say, wait a second, you're injecting, virus DNA into me, and you're injecting virus, RNA, and it's going to change my cell. That's not what happens. RNA is very, very labile. In other words, it doesn't like to sit around. It just degrades very quickly. Your body has proteins called nucleases that will take this thing apart, and it will break them down into basically, nothing. They don't really do anything. They're just other, small little pieces of material, but they're not really usable. So this type of mRNA is not something that sits around for months or years and years. It basically degrades shortly after it gets in your body, but it stays around long enough that your body can use it to produce these spike proteins. Your body then recognizes these spike proteins. Your immune system recognizes these spike proteins and can form an immune response. But it doesn't infect your body with the virus. And so that's the strategy behind this. Now, it sounds very complicated, and it is very complicated. And again, like I said, anybody can go, do a molecular genetics or a cellular biology lecture and get to some of the basics of this. But, this is a really new technology in the sense that it hasn't been used in therapeutics in humans before. It's not entirely new in the sense that, people have been doing this for quite some time, I believe. Don't quote me on this, but I want to say that they started experimenting with mRNA technology and delivery systems back in the 90s. So this has been around for a while, but it really hasn't found a big usage at this point until this pandemic came on. And so you have this, this new technology that's been introduced. And so far, the two mRNA vaccines, the Moderna and the Pfizer BioNTech vaccines, those two vaccines have proven to have been extremely effective in preventing infection, upwards of 94 to 95% effective in preventing infection, which for a vaccine is really high. That's a very, very good number, actually. I hope that helped to kind of clarify.
Yeah. So, but then there's this other variety of the vaccine also. Do we know
Correct.
which one is being pushed out? Or does it vary by country, or do we have a choice, or what?
You probably will have a choice, and yes, it is based on a country. But it's there are over 30 vaccines in trial right now. So I mean, this is a big time effort by many different pharmaceutical and biotech companies. This is a huge effort. The two that have come to FDA emergency authorization quickly were the Pfizer vaccine and then the Moderna vaccine. Those were the two mRNA vaccines that were developed. And then there is the kind of next in the pipeline are the Johnson & Johnson and the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine. And those are a little bit different. Those two work primarily through what's called an adenovirus vector, where they actually use the DNA as a DNA strand. This is how I understand it. I've studied it to some extent. I wasn't on any of the teams developed on any of this stuff, obviously. But from what I've read and tried to understand about these, they use a different virus called an adenovirus, which is a very, very common virus. And they basically create a DNA strand within the adenovirus, a dead adenovirus, and this is then introduced into the body, into the human body. And the adenovirus is another infectious virus. It is taken into the cells and releases that DNA, which then goes into the nucleus, and then it forms mRNA, and then it goes through the process we just talked about, where the mRNA is used to code proteins, and then these proteins are then expressed. It's essentially another vector of introducing genetic material of the coronavirus into your cells, so that your cells can express those proteins, and then your immune system can respond without actually being infected with the coronavirus itself. So it's sort of similar, but it's different in the strategy behind it. And in the United States, the two that will be primarily used, at least in the short term, are going to be Pfizer and Moderna. And in England and Great Britain right now, they're starting to roll out the Oxford vaccine. And I think, I don't know how this will all sort of pan out from a world perspective, but I will say that I see that some of the other vaccines, like the Oxford vaccine and perhaps the Johnson & Johnson vaccine and maybe Moderna, will be more likely to go to other countries, especially developing countries, because one of the logistical challenges is these vaccines, especially the Pfizer vaccine, have to be kept at an extremely low temperature. I mean, we're talking, I think it was like 90 degrees below zero for the
Yeah, I saw that.
Pfizer vaccine. And, if you're in, rural India or, Cambodia, most of those places don't have the capacity to power refrigeration units that are going to keep that vaccine viable for any length of time. So some of the other ones are more heat stable, and they only have to be refrigerated at a normal refrigerator temperature, which is much more conducive to developing countries or areas where it tends to be more tropical or subtropical, and they don't have good refrigeration units. Excuse me.
Yeah, that is a problem, isn't it? Okay, by the way, we're with Dr. Ryan Hada right now. He's an ER physician. He's seen it all, pretty sure, but a lot of COVID for the past almost year now. And so he's seen his way around it and felt his way around it. And I'm very confident when I talk to folks about this subject, and I don't know anything about anything. I'm not a doctor in any way. But I can say, hey, wait a minute. I know I have a good friend who's actually an ER doctor who deals with COVID every day. He can tell you the straight stuff. Just from experience. It's not anything more than, hey, this is what God's called him to do, and he's fulfilling that. So we really appreciate your input on this, because a lot of folks are, kind of understandably nervous. Some people don't like vaccines at all. They'll never take one for anything. And I'm like, well, maybe we should think about this one. It's just kind of disrupting the whole universe. So what do you feel about that? Would you recommend that people take it? Do you have reservations? As someone who sees these things all the time, is there an issue that would prevent you from getting it or from advising someone against it?
Yeah, that's actually a very important point. And first off, I want to say, as everybody probably knows here, I'm not giving any medical advice. I mean, this is not me giving any one person medical advice.
Yes, thank you.
I always would recommend that you speak with your physician, a trusted physician, about what is right for you medically, whether this vaccine or taking an aspirin or anything that you think medically you have a question on. Go to your family physician, go to a trusted physician who you know, who can objectively help you work through some of these things. Now, with that being said, let me just talk about some of the concerns. I can't go through them all because, my goodness, there are way too many. But let's just talk about maybe the top three that I kind of see out there. The first is, boy, this thing was developed fast, but can we trust it? I mean, we don't know the long-term side effects. Well, if you listen to what I said back when we were first doing this podcast about 6 months ago, or maybe a little longer, I had reservations. And to be very honest, I still do. Look, it was developed fast, and we don't know all the potential side effects, either short or long term at this point. Okay? That being said, that has not really stopped us from continuing down the path of, medical therapies. One thing I always tell everybody is this: any medical therapy, it doesn't matter if it's an ibuprofen or chemotherapy for cancer or a major surgery or you're, going to take an aspirin. Whatever medical therapy you want to potentially take, there is a risk and a benefit to it. Always a risk and a benefit, and we must always weigh the risks and benefits. In some cases, there is minimal risk, high benefit. In some cases, there's high risk, high benefit. In some cases, there's high risk, low benefit. So we need to understand that dynamic between risk and benefit. And so I would talk to your physician about what the risk benefit is for you in this particular scenario, because not everybody's going to fall under the same risk reward or risk benefit ratio just based on who they are, what their pre-existing conditions are, their age, their exposures, whatever. So that's kind of how I would approach this. One of the things that is a bit concerning to me beyond that is that there is a lot of misconception, and so people are sometimes making decisions based on a lot of misinformation and misconception. And while we don't know all the long-term side effects of this, and it was developed in a relatively fast manner, what we do know is that this isn't, like I said, a totally new technology. I mean, this kind of technology has been out for a while, and they've been researching. When I say they, I don't mean some, like faceless group. What I mean is researchers at a lot of top universities, some of the smartest people in the world, have been researching this type of therapeutic for years, decades. I mean, honestly, this has been around for a long time. This situation is really unique. And I want to just bring that up, that people say, gosh, they developed this thing super fast. Well, yes, they did because of necessity. But I want to bring to the forefront of everybody, because, and I don't know how to say this gently, there's a lot of online traffic and a lot of social media misinformation that says, this is poison. You don't know what they're putting in your body. Don't take this because of whatever. Let me tell you, I have worked with some, researchers in these fields, and I'll tell you, they are hard workers. They are not mean people. They are not trying to kill you. They are working extremely hard, sometimes read some of these stories, 24-hour shifts. They are sleeping in the lab. They are working around the clock, spending time away from their families, giving up holidays, giving up everything to bring this to the forefront. And they're not doing it to try and hurt you. They're doing it to try and save people. And to spread misinformation, look, if you want to take it or don't take it, that's totally up to you. I'm not going to, like I said, I'm not going to tell you, talk to your doctor about that. You make a decision based on good information. But to spread misinformation or to call something a quote-unquote poison or something like that is a slap in the face to these folks that are working real hard. And you better believe there are believers. I know there are hardcore believers and very hardworking, smart individuals that are putting these things forward. And if you are disparaging their efforts based on misinformation or a lack of understanding because you're not willing to put the groundwork into understanding how this works, I don't know what else to say, but it's a slap in the face. And I can relate to that in some ways, because there's been a lot of things said and done about healthcare workers at this point that have, that have been sort of, I don't know, a slap in the face to healthcare workers, and that's a bit of a different story. So I would just be very cautious. We're not called to disparage these folks or their products or whatever they're trying to do, their efforts. If you don't understand it, get understanding. If you don't agree with it, that's totally okay. But be cautious when you call something what it's not. Don't call something a poison when you don't know if it's poison or not.
Yeah, that really needs to be said. And as a non-doctor, I'll weigh in on that. And please, if you're one of these, please stop insulting the medical profession. It's just counterproductive. They're literally, they've been, whether they're believers or not, they have dedicated their lives to helping humans survive and have an improved quality of life and to cure disease. That's what they do with their day. And that's more than a lot of people do with their life. So let's ease up on this a little bit. Like you say, this is not a secret, Bill Gates and Anthony Fauci in the corner creating something that'll hurt people. This is something that's an emergency. And so they're treating it like an emergency. And yeah, let's get something out here that can help somebody, even if it saves, a minimal amount. It's better than not having it. But anyways, yes, please. Folks are literally, healthcare workers are dropping dead because they're trying to help people. Right? Either from COVID or from exhaustion, they just can't take it anymore. I'm sure you personally have lots of stories of folks you going home and crying at night because they just can't take us.
I'll tell you, and I'll just share a couple things. So I was looking the other day, and look, I was, people may or may not know this, I was in the Army Reserves for a long time, so I have a lot of, I love soldiers and Marines. I love military history and that kind of stuff. Incredible respect. Both my father and my grandfather were, in the Army in Vietnam and World War II. I have a lot of, family history in that, and I really love, the United States military, soldiers, Marines, sailors, Air Force, all of them. Just a lot of friends in that. And I want to be very clear. I want to say that up front that I'm not in any way disparaging it. But in the deadliest year in Iraq, in the conflict in Iraq, that was 2007. And according to resources I read, about 904 soldiers, sailors, Marines died during that. Airmen died in that year, 2007. That was the deadliest year in the conflict in Iraq. In 2020, in 9 months, according to the Kaiser, I think it was Kaiser Permanente study, 2,900 healthcare workers have died from COVID. Over three times the amount. That's pretty insane. I mean, think about that. And I can tell you, I've been in healthcare for almost going on 20 years now. I have not seen any of my colleagues die from infectious disease in this fashion. And in the last 2 months, I know 2 that have died. I've had other friends die, and I've seen many of my friends get sick and be in the hospital. Some of them permanently or semi-permanently for a very long time. I've seen people get totally burned out. I've talked to people that I've known for years and years and years that are just about done with this. And I'll tell you, and I don't mean they're done with the coronavirus, although they're sick of it. They're done with this idea of fighting a fight when there doesn't seem to be any serious support in many ways. You almost feel like you're left hanging. And I don't mean to I'm not disparaging anyone. I'm not, we get there's been a lot of great support, incredible people doing incredible stuff. And I want to thank everybody for that. But, this is a real fight. I can't tell you how many people I've seen get sick as a dog from this thing, get taken out of work for weeks or months, and even die. And I can't tell you how many hands I've held of family members now telling them, I don't know if your husband or your wife or your mother, your father, or your son or your daughter is going to make it because of this. And I'm not unique. I'm not even in one of the worst parts of the country, but I know people that are in some of the worst parts of the country, and they are exhausted. I'm telling you, they're really tired of this. And so, spreading misinformation and rumors about this is very counterproductive in so many ways. It's hard for people to imagine watching their friends and their colleagues who they work with, who are doing nothing but trying to save lives, get taken out by this thing because people aren't using common sense precautions, and they're not, they're minimizing it or poo-pooing it or whatever. I just, my heart breaks in some ways, and it can be frustrating. On the same level, I get it. People are tired. COVID fatigue is very real. Like, everybody's got it. Lockdowns are not always the most sensible thing by any stretch of the imagination. Locking down communities is not good. Destroying businesses, the suicides, the drug use, the alcohol, all that stuff, overdoses, all those things are sort of side effects of the social dysfunction that we're feeling right now. And that social dysfunction is coming from a multitude of different areas, but certainly can be related in many ways to some of the lockdown or draconian sort of social restrictions that have occurred. So I'm not minimizing that. I think it's a very, very real thing. And we can talk a little bit about how we can address that later and what we should be doing and what it should be looking like versus what the reality is that's happening right now. But that's sort of a side note. I guess I want to get back a little bit to the vaccines without getting too far off, because there were two other things I just wanted to mention, and one of them is the ethical concern, with regard to the vaccines, the ethical concern that a lot of people have as to whether or not these were developed using aborted fetal tissue. Very, very real concern. And I'm sitting here looking at an article that literally goes through all the different vaccines and talks about whether or not they were developed using aborted fetal tissue. This is a big deal for a lot of people, especially believers. Let me first say that what this is really about is whether, and this goes much deeper in ethically as to what, how we value human life. But these aborted fetal cell lines, okay, that are being used, they've been around for almost 50 years. They are not the aborted fetal cells, okay? They're not the fetal cells. They are developed hundreds and hundreds of generations, in many cases, down the line. They have been used in therapeutics across the board. And there's a good chance that no matter where you stand on the issue, you've probably already been impacted or taken a therapeutic that has been used in some way or has been developed or tested in some way on a fetal cell line. Okay, there's a good chance of that. There's a much higher chance that you have already done that than there is that you haven't. So that being said, it's not something that we need to dismiss. I think there's definitely an ethical question there, but it's a much deeper ethical question. And whether or not you use an aborted fetal cell line in the development or the testing of a vaccine to save lives, and whether you as an individual take that vaccine that was then maybe developed or tested on a fetal cell line, doesn't necessarily translate to whether or not you agree with abortion or anything like that. We need to be very clear about that. There's not, you're not giving some type of what's the word I'm looking for? You're not agreeing with it. You're not giving it your
You're not compromising on it.
You're not compromising, I don't think, anyway. Now, people may differ with me on this, and that's fine. We can have a discussion about that. Mm-hmm. But those kind of things are so far down the road that, and they're so widespread within medicine that it's very hard to know what hasn't been tested or developed on a fetal cell line. And so, I mean, you just have to understand that it's an ethical issue. It is. I agree with that. But it's not like they're aborting fetuses to then test this on. That's not what this is. These are cell lines that were developed 50 years ago that have been used in dozens, if not hundreds, of therapeutics, and they're in some ways being used in some vaccines. Not all. Not all the vaccines have used it by any stretch, but some have used it in some fashion or another. Many of them didn't actually develop it based on these, but maybe they did some testing on it because it's a human cell line, and it's a much more valid way of testing the vaccine before you inject it in a person. So, that's sort of a deep ethical question. But one thing I want to say is you're not getting fetal cells injected in you. Okay, I've seen that from a lot of people, and I hate to say, you're not getting fetal parts injected in you by these vaccines. That is pure fantasy. You're not getting fetal cells injected in you. You're not getting fetal parts injected in you. I don't even know where that came from. So, that's some serious misinformation that has created an ethical stir amongst many people. But again, it's not true. It's not the actual question. It's a manipulation of the information to create fear, to create anxiety around this, or to advance an agenda. I hate to say there's no other real way. It's either they don't know and they're fearful, or they're creating potentially some type of an agenda. So
yeah, that's unfortunate. And you said there was one other point on the vaccine also you wanted to say?
It kind of goes into the next stage, but the next thing we were going to maybe talk about in terms of sort of talking about variants and variations within the virus. But it really is about sort of the way that these vaccines are developed. I don't know if this will be the case, but this rapid development of a vaccine is not entirely unprecedented in the sense that because you have to look at how it was done. It is unprecedented in the time frame, but in terms of how the studies were done, this was not something that was totally rushed through. Okay, that's what a lot of people say, rushed through. Well, it happened rapidly, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's rushed through. And this kind of goes into the next part of the conversation. But when you're looking at doing vaccine research, it's a function of several different things. And probably one of the biggest determiners of whether or not you're going to be able to complete your research is whether or not you're going to have patients available that are going to be potentially exposed to the thing you're trying to vaccinate for. In this case, for better or for worse, there were a lot of available human beings to enroll in the study. Okay. For example, the Zika vaccine, it went through fairly quickly, but what happened is during, I believe it was phase 2 or phase 3 trials, Zika sort of dried up. It just kind of went away. So all of a sudden you had this vaccine that was in the pipe to be developed, but there was no one really to test it on. You didn't really have the population there to test it on, which is going to slow the development down. And then also the money dried up because who's going to pay a lot of money to develop a vaccine for a disease that's not really present anymore. So there are a lot of factors that go into developing these. Well, this vaccine development was almost like the sweet spot, if you want to say, of vaccine development. You had an almost unlimited number of patients because everybody could potentially get exposed around the world. Okay, it's a true pandemic. You had a whole lot of money pouring into this thing, and you had a very good need. Okay, so there was an overwhelming perception of need. So you had these three factors that came together, and when those three factors met in this sort of perfect storm of coronavirus, it created the environment for which a vaccine could be rapidly developed. And the fourth thing that people don't talk about is the incredible technology that we have nowadays. I mean, just even from 5 or 10 years ago, the technology to develop and to manufacture and roll these things out in production, as well as the ability to distribute them from a logistics standpoint, is incredible. It really is. I mean, it's a true incredible thing to watch happen. So, yes, it was pushed through relatively quickly, and we don't know all the true side effects long term, but, this was a really, really unique effort that I don't think anybody's seen in the history of the world. So those are some of the things that I wanted to just bring up about the vaccines.
That's very helpful, man. Thank you. So Dr. Ryan's with us. Again, this is the Corona Pandemic Podcast. We have a website. You can check all our previous episodes. Of course, we're on Apple Podcasts and Google and everything else. So just share it with your friends. That would be the best thing you can do. And educate ourselves on this. So we love Dr. Ryan for doing this. And as a believer, it's an extra level of trust, I think, that we can give as well to him and just work through this as a family, so to speak. The second thing we want to talk about is what we're calling variants, or some would call a mutation of this. Mm-hmm. And the big concern is that all these vaccines that we're talking about and how maybe potentially great of a game changer they are, maybe they won't even work on these new variations. What is the as far as you understand, what has happened so far? How many variations are there? What can we expect from that?
Yeah, so there are, from what first off, as soon as the virus came out, there were some people tracking this genetically, and the variance in this thing is widespread, and we know that there are multiple different variants that have come from all over the place, and most of them it really was fairly inconsequential. In other words, yeah, there was a genetic variant because genetic mutations happen. It's an absolute fact that genetic mutations will happen, but they didn't particularly impact much of what was actually occurring. It was a way to sort of genetically track, the virus, sort of like, I don't know, whatever those ancestry things, whatever, they can kind of tell you, give them a, sample of your DNA and they'll track you back in history. Well, you can kind of do that with a virus too. On a shorter scale, you can say, okay, well, this virus is similar to this virus in this area. And so we can look at time and geography to see where these things came from and at what time they were there. Well, what we're seeing now, what is happening in Great Britain, and now it's in the United States, and also there's a new variant in South Africa, is that there is a more infectious variant. That's what the experts apparently are calling it. Now, a lot of media and other people are saying it's a new strain. I don't know. That's sort of a technical term. I tend to think it's more of a variant because it doesn't seem to really be like a whole new strain of it. It's really more of a variant within the SARS-CoV-2, or the coronavirus, the COVID-19 sort of just disease, but it's more infectious for whatever reason. It's a mutation in that quote unquote, that spike protein that we talked about, that's going to be the target for the vaccines. And this variant is, according to the data that I read, up to about 70%, I want to say, more infectious. What that means is that it's, some of the things what it means in a practical sense is that potentially more people could be infected more rapidly. So if one person has this variant, it's more likely they will give it to more people over a shorter period of time, which means that some of the mitigation strategies like masks and social distancing may be less effective. It doesn't seem to be more virulent it doesn't seem to be more deadly. It doesn't seem to cause a more deadly disease than the other variants. But what we could see is it could cause a spike in the infection rate. And if it's just a pure, if you're looking at just a pure numbers game, if you have, about a 1% case fatality rate across the board now in the United States, I think is what it is, about 1.2%, something like that. If you have 1,000 people, then you're going to have 10 people that die from it. Well, if you get 1,000 people within a population and 10 die, and then you all of a sudden get this new variant introduced into a population, you may get, more people, 70% more. I'm not sure if that's exactly how the math works out, but, 70% more, which could certainly lead to more death, more severe illness, more just numbers of severe illness. But it doesn't necessarily cause you to die more. It isn't more likely to cause you to die. It isn't more likely to cause you to have severe illness.
Do we know? I'm sorry to interrupt you, Doctor. Do we know? Can you be reinfected? Well, we know you can get it twice because it's happened to my relatives. Regular COVID. If this new variant is out there, can you have been diagnosed and recovered from COVID-19 and then get this other variant later?
I don't know. I don't think there's enough data to see. But I agree with you. I've seen several patients now that have actually had it, and then they got it again. It's not common. I mean, it's not real common, but it does happen.
My grandmother, my grandma got it twice this year. It's spring, and then in June she got it again. Thank God she recovered both times. But she's in a in a home situation where it's just, this is where it's really propagating so fast, and Anyway, so yes, you can. So to say, well, I've had it, I'm good to go, is really not adequate, right? And it certainly not doesn't mean you can go to parties again or whatever. Especially if there are new variations out there. Well, maybe you can get that one now, and like you say, that's even more destructive potentially to spread it. So yeah, I think we should be on top of this for sure.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I was thinking about the other day, and nobody knows if this is going to be true, and I'm not trying to predict the future or anything like this, but when you're talking about these genetic variations and you're talking about potential differences in, antigenicity or what the virus is able to do in terms of how it infects people or how it overcomes vaccines or treatments, there is a very well-known thing in medicine, and most people understand this on a pretty straightforward basis, is that, if the viruses and bacteria are constantly changing, they're constantly mutating. And I don't mean that they're evolving in the sense of, into something else, but what they're doing is they're evolving their ability to evade treatments. Very common thing we see in the hospital is antibiotic resistance. It's a very common thing. We see it all the time in bacteria, that bacteria will genetically evolve to resist certain bacteria or to resist certain antibiotics. And so one of the principles behind that is if you give somebody an incomplete course of antibiotic, what you actually do is select out the resistant strains, because the resistant strains can survive this antibiotic, whereas the susceptible strains will die from it. Now, if you complete a whole course and you are able to kill most of the bacteria, your body can often come in and take care of whatever resistant strains, and so you don't get what's called an antibiotic-resistant infection. Okay? Now, if you apply that to a population like the world or the United States or anywhere, but if you apply that to a population, there's certainly within the realm of possibility a resistance that could develop to the vaccine if you don't vaccinate enough people over time, because genetic variations are a function of two primary issues. The first is the number of infections and the number of virus and the number of transmissions, okay, because it is constantly changing its genetics on a small scale, but it's also a function of time. So you have, just in terms of volume and time, high volume and long time almost inevitably guarantees you a significant amount of genetic variation. I mean, that's just reality. Low volume of virus, like if you have a very low volume of virus, it's going to take a whole lot longer to develop that variation because you just don't have the sheer numbers of genetic variations occurring over, at any given time. Does that make sense? It's a little hard to conceptualize, but I want that to make sense.
Yeah, I think so.
So high volume virus, if you have a high viral load across the population and a lot of transmission, your time to variations are very short. So what you saw is within 9 months, we have a variation that's actually changed the way the virus behaves, okay, within 9 months. That's a fairly short time frame that this virus has now changed the way it behaves, okay? And the reason is because we have a whole lot of virus out there. There's a ton of virus all over the world, right? Well, the part of the vaccine strategy is to decrease the viral load across the world to where we can get what's called herd immunity, which means that the virus doesn't significantly impact people who are not immunized from it because everyone else around them is immunized. So if you have 10 people who are immunized and 3 that are not, those 3 are unlikely to get it because where are they going to get it? They're not going to get it from the immunized people. Does that make sense?
Right, yeah.
Although we don't know, I should caveat that by saying we don't know for sure if when you get immunized, you're not able to transmit it. But the chances of you getting clinical illness are much, much lower, which is just, would suggest that your viral load is going to be much, much lower, so your transmission is going to be much, much lower. But anyway, kind of getting back to this kind of complicated variance issue, one of the things that could potentially happen, and it hasn't happened yet, is that if you vaccinate a certain part of the population, and let's say it's not even close to what would be considered the herd immunity level, well, what you've essentially done is given the population as a whole sort of a half dose of a treatment. And you may select out a resistant virus to this. In other words, you're going to put genetic pressure on the virus to select out a resistant variant that may overcome the vaccine. So it may be able to evade the vaccine over time. So that's why this vaccine process is actually pretty important. Okay, and why I've been telling people that we may really only get one shot at tamping this down in this fashion. I'm not an expert in this kind of thing and whatnot. I'll be very honest about that. But just from what I kind of understand and see, if a bunch of people do not get vaccinated, and I want to be clear, I'm not telling everybody to get vaccinated. I'm just trying to put the information out there. If we don't achieve herd immunity, and we have this smoldering population of infection, okay, the population over here with a smoldering infection, then over a period of time, it's possible that you could see a variant emerge that resists the vaccine. And what it does for all the vaccinated people is now the bug gets back into them and you're back to square one. You see what I'm saying? Now you got like all these people that can get whatever. And now you got to go back to the drawing board and come up with a new vaccine. And so that's kind of how this, may happen. I don't know. My concern isn't so much with the United States, although there is a decent amount of resistance to the vaccines here for different reasons and that kind of thing. But I'll tell you, my big concern is in places like where the thing came from, however you want to believe it came from Wuhan, it came from Wuhan. Wuhan's a big, dense population center. And, if you look at dense population centers like places in India and Bangladesh and China and parts of Southeast Asia, with, in a lot of those places like hygiene and social distancing are really impossible. Those are the areas where you might see those things starting to emerge. So it's just, I don't mean, I was telling somebody this today and they said, boy, you're just, just
Dr. Doom.
Debbie Downer. Yeah, I'm Dr. Doom. I'm like, no. On the flip side, let me give you I was listening to a guy who's, he's a PhD, he's a smart guy with all these vaccines. He understands these vaccines very, very well. And he was saying that, and I don't know, again, I'm not involved in the development of vaccines, but from what this gentleman was saying, because mRNA is almost like it's almost like a designer drug kind of thing, where you can design the drug to target whatever you're trying to target. And you can do it relatively quickly with the technology that's available today. If a variant comes up that does overcome the vaccine with mRNA technology, it's possible that you could relatively quickly come up with a different mRNA that would directly target this new variant. So that may be something that, this mRNA technology, I don't want to underscore it. This is, I think from a medical perspective, this potentially could be a game changer in terms of what we're going to see happen and how we as a healthcare community approach therapeutics for a lot of diseases. We'll see. We'll see what the future holds, but I think it could be a potential game changer.
Amen. Well, let's hope so. All right, Dr. Ryan. So we've reached almost the end of our time here. I do want to get in, as a believer, the most critical piece of this, which is veritas, which is the truth. And I know you wanted to discuss this, and I know we want to keep it as cool-headed as we can, being a helpful podcast like we are, even though pastor and doctor have their own opinions on things. Obviously, as a Christian, the truth is a person, and so we know Jesus is the truth and is the source of it. And yet, his people, the believers in him, just in my circles that I can give you evidence of, and you can give evidence of, but I'm sure it's true all over the world, are believing a lot of stuff that's not true today, specifically about this situation and about other things. So what did you want to get out about that and maybe throw a word of caution or encouragement out to the church about?
Yeah, and it's interesting. I want to go a little bit back to the history of, the sort of the Christian movement over time, and it's particularly in response to things like this. pandemics and that kind of thing, where there have been many, and I won't belabor them. People can read about them if they want, but in many cases, believers, they flocked to the suffering, and they were in many cases willing to mourn with the suffering, to weep with the suffering, and to identify with them, and in many, many cases to die with the suffering. And they did it in a spirit of love to alleviate. And I, like I was saying with this vaccine, you kind of get one shot at a lot of this stuff. You get one shot at really trying to mitigate. You get one shot. Once the cat's out of the bag, or the virus is out of the bag, so to speak, chaos ensues. You kind of get one shot with this vaccine. If it doesn't really work, then, or there's a lot of problems, you may end up with, untoward fallout down the road because there's a lot of mistrust out there. Well, from a believer's perspective, and I'll just be very honest, we're going to get one shot at this. And you know what? The world's watching, and the world doesn't know him. Let's be honest. The world doesn't know the Messiah. They don't know that they don't know the Savior. Okay, And we are supposed to be the ones who are bearing the cross, who pick up the cross. And it seems, in my opinion, and I may get lambasted for this particular thing, that many people are picking up something other than the cross, and I don't know why that is. And that gets into a pretty heavy discussion. But if you look historically, specifically about how believers in many cases have reacted to pandemics, and reacted to persecution, and I'm not saying we're persecuted in the United States by any stretch, but a lot of my friends in other countries are, but reacted to persecution and reacted to opposition to the body of Christ. There's a humility that needs to come with that, and a compassion, and the heart of a servant, because if the world sees the body of Christ acting in a way that is, how can I say this without sounding, harsh, but is minimizing the suffering, or putting, something other than, Christ without lifting Christ up, then it in many ways invalidates our witness, and it really, really creates so many problems for so many people. And so what I've really tried to tell people in some cases is, the body of Christ, we're called to rise up, but we're not called to rise up against the culture, and we're not called to rise up against governments, and we're not called to rise up against authority. We're called to rise up above it. We're called to be like the serpent on a pole, like the Messiah on a cross. We're to rise up above it, and to, at the same time, kneel down in the depths of the trenches in the suffering. And, I'm in a unique position where I actually can do that as part of my job. But there are a lot of other places where we as the body can utilize that unique position that God has given us as humble servants and as compassionate people to minister to those that are hurting and suffering, monetarily, physically, spiritually. It's again, everybody knows there's a rise in drug use, suicide, alcohol abuse, physical abuse. We know there's a lot of suffering in the world, and as believers, I think in many ways God is calling us out of the walls of the church. He's trying to do that. He's saying, look, I want you to worship, and that's part of what we do as the body. But we're not, I can't think of any New Testament or Old Testament that says that we should, sit in and, do a lot of things that potentially put people in danger. And I know people would have differences with me in certain scriptures and whatnot, and that would be more of a one-on-one conversation. But we're certainly all called to go out and be the hands and feet of Christ, and to fulfill the Great Commission, and to make disciples. And we make disciples by leading the way, in how we serve and how we love people. and not necessarily how we adhere to or get caught up in things that are often not true or have an element of truth but a large element of falsehood to them. And so I would just encourage my brothers and sisters to really kind of submit themselves to the Spirit in this, and to ask where God is calling you in this, to serve the suffering and those that are hurting, because there has been an incredible amount of suffering. I mean, my goodness, it's pretty much it's unbelievable in this country how much suffering is occurring, and yet it seems I don't know, I'm not quite sure where a lot of the believers are in this. We'll see.
Yeah, brother, I am totally with you, and I'm watching along with you as well. And it's frustrating and concerning, and the fact that the instructions of the Lord are very, very simple in this. Very simple. Mm-hmm. You are to address this. You are to help. You are to pray for them. You are to deliver. You are to be an ear. You are to, right? None of this stuff is, like you say, being rebellious against your nation, your government systems, whatever. God has put these things in place for a purpose, whether you agree with them or not. It really doesn't matter. Like you said, we're supposed to be on another level there. God, heaven is above these things, and that's where we get our power from, is from the Holy Spirit. We're not doing anything ourselves. Once we put ourselves out there and say, look, I'm going to care for the sick and heal the sick and the blind and the lame. I mean, that's what Jesus did. And that's what he told us to do. So I don't really, with you, I don't really understand the issue there. But we need to pray all over this thing, and all over workers like yourself who have dedicated their lives to helping the sick and not only physically but spiritually. So we want to pray for you, Dr. Ryan, and everything that you have to go to work right now, which is why we have to end this podcast. But we sincerely really love you, and we love what you are offering here. I know our sister Micah is listening right along and commenting also, and this servant attitude is what we need to cultivate for sure, no matter if we have a title in the church or not, or just some secular work that we do. We are all called to the same thing, which is service. And if you want to be great in the kingdom of God, you be the servant of all. You already said it.
Amen.
We just have to apply that. So I just want to bless you, man. And anything you just want to say in closing here before you head off and save some more lives?
Yeah, amen. We talk a lot about, our ministries, and the word ministry, the word minister and ministry, that really comes from the idea of being a servant. Like you said, it really is like that. It should be our primary goal, is to serve and to love. And, even if we disagree with people, and we will, heartily disagree with people, we still love our enemies. We pray for them, and so I would just encourage everybody to rise above and to pick up your cross and to serve your neighbors and your enemies and the Samaritans and the people on the road, whoever. Just rise above and try and serve as best you can in this situation. Because, like I said, we really get one shot and the world is watching. So.
Amen, brother. Let's leave it there. Love you so much. Love all of you for participating here. Please again share this and get the information out there, because as it looks, the Lord's not done with this yet. So let's just be as obedient and servant minded as we can. Thank you, Dr. Ryan, brother. Love you, man.
Thank you very much, Chris. You guys take care.
For previous episodes and to support this podcast, please go to coronapandemicpodcast.com.